I'm Sloane, I'm 29, and on a Tuesday afternoon, my mother called me sounding proud of herself, like she'd just done something generous. "We added your sister to your account, honey, the $145,000 one from Grandpa. She needs the help, and you have plenty." I hadn't given anyone permission to add a single dollar sign to that account, let alone a co-owner. 48 hours later, $40,000 of it was gone. I want to tell you what happened in those 48 hours and in the weeks after them. It involves a custodial account law nobody in my family had ever bothered to actually read. A signature on a bank form that wasn't mine. A withdrawal request from 6 months earlier that had already failed once, quietly before anyone tried again and succeeded. And a sister whose desperation turned out to run so much deeper than either my mother or I understood. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the people who get told to just be generous are usually the ones who end up reading the fine print closest. If you've ever had someone decide, on your behalf, what you owed your own family, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment and let me know you're here. My grandfather opened that account the week I was born, seeding it with a modest gift and a plan he explained to me more than once before he died. A custodial investment account under the Uniform Transfers to Minors Act, meant to grow quietly through my childhood, and then, legally, become fully and completely mine, once I reached the age the account's terms specified. My mother served as custodian in the meantime, technically responsible for managing it in my interest, until that transfer date arrived. I grew up understanding it existed in the vague way kids understand things adults handle on their behalf, and didn't think much more about it until I was old enough to actually watch the statements come in myself. I spent the better part of the last 8 years contributing to that account myself, on top of what my grandfather originally left it. Steady deposits from a career in financial planning that admittedly gave me more insight into exactly how these accounts are supposed to work than most people my age ever get. By this spring, between his original gift, the market's slow compounding, and years of my own careful additions, the balance had grown to just over $145,000, money I'd been quietly earmarking for a down payment on a house I was hoping to buy with him the next year or two. My younger sister Paige and I have always had a complicated closeness, the kind built out of genuine love, tangled up with years of very different relationships to money and responsibility. She's 26, warm and funny in a way that's made her easy to love our whole lives, and also, for about as long as I can remember, someone who struggled to hold on to financial stability for more than a year or two at a stretch. I never resented her for that exactly. I just quietly learned, somewhere along the way, to keep my own finances a little more private than I might have otherwise, a habit that would end up mattering more than I ever expected it to. I want to be honest that some part of me always sensed our mother kept a mental ledger between us, even if she'd have denied it if asked directly. Paige as the one who needed extra patience and support, me as the one who could always be counted on to manage without it. I didn't resent that role either, not exactly, not for most of my life. I think I even took some quiet pride in being the daughter nobody had to worry about. It's strange, looking back now, how much that particular pride ended up costing me the moment someone finally decided not worrying about me also meant not needing to ask me anything at all. Growing up, Paige and I shared a room until she was 12, and I remember more clearly than almost anything else from that period how naturally I fell into a kind of junior caretaker role with her, helping with homework, covering for her when she snuck out, quietly smoothing over small conflicts before they reached our parents. I don't think either of us consciously chose those roles. They just settled into place the way sibling dynamics often do, shaped by whatever gaps needed filling in a household, stretched a little thin in its own ways. I loved being the one she came to. I just never once imagined, all those years, that being the one she came to would eventually mean being the one whose trust got spent without her ever being consulted about the withdrawal. The Tuesday everything started, my mother called with what I assumed, at first, was ordinary family catch-up, asking about work, mentioning a neighbor's renovation, the usual rhythm of our weekly calls. About 10 minutes in, her tone shifted into something brighter, almost celebratory. "I wanted to tell you something good," she said. "We added your sister to your account, the one from your grandfather. She's been having such a hard time, and I know you have plenty sitting there, so it just made sense." I asked her, genuinely confused. What exactly added meant? She said, cheerfully, like she was announcing a nice surprise rather than something I might have wanted to say I'm still listed as custodian, sweetheart, so it was simple. She's a joint owner now, too. I sat very still at my kitchen table for a long moment after that sentence landed, running through, as calmly as I could manage, every reason this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Mom, I've had full control of that account for years. You haven't been the actual custodian since I turned 21. She brushed past that detail entirely. The bank still had me on file, apparently, so it wasn't hard at all. Upset about this, Sloane? Family is supposed to help each other, I asked her more firmly now, to undo whatever she'd done immediately. She told me she'd already explained everything to the bank, and that she didn't understand why I was making this so complicated before changing the subject to a recipe she wanted to share. I sat with the phone still in my hand for a full minute after we hung up, the recipe details washing over me without landing at all. I remember staring at my own reflection in the dark kitchen window, trying to reconcile the casual, cheerful tone she'd used with the actual weight of what she'd just told me. It wasn't the first time in my life she'd made a unilateral decision and framed it as a gift. It was, as far as I could remember, the first time the decision had come with a dollar amount attached large enough to genuinely frighten me. I called my brokerage the moment we hung up, hands not quite steady on the phone, and spent nearly 40 minutes on hold before reaching a representative who could only confirm, vaguely, that some account maintenance requests had recently been submitted and were pending internal review. She couldn't tell me specifics without additional verification, citing standard privacy protocols that, in this particular moment, felt less like protection and more like an infuriating wall between me and my own money. I hung up with more questions than I'd started with, and a low, steady hum of dread that wouldn't quite settle for the rest of that night. I tried calling back twice more that same evening, each time reaching a different representative, each time hitting a similarly frustrating wall of protocol designed, I understood intellectually, to protect account holders from exactly the kind of unauthorized access I was now worried had already happened, but which in practice just meant I couldn't get a straight answer about my own account. Without jumping through verification steps that took time, I didn't feel like I had. I finally gave up around 11 that night, lying awake replaying my mother's cheerful voice, unable to shake the feeling that something much larger than a misunderstanding was already quietly in motion. I made the mistake, that same evening, of mentioning the situation in our family group chat, hoping for some backup, some acknowledgement that what my mother had done wasn't normal. What I got instead was a wave of gentle, well-meaning pressure, aimed entirely in the wrong direction. My aunt wrote, "She's your sister Sloane, you're so lucky to even have that kind of money sitting around." A cousin added a laughing emoji next to the word drama. Nobody asked whether I'd actually consented to any of it. I put my phone face down on the counter that night, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel this early into the situation. Not just anger at my mother, but specific, disorienting loneliness at realizing how quickly my entire extended family had decided, without a single fact in hand, that I was the one being unreasonable. I typed out a long, careful explanation in that group chat at one point, laying out exactly why the account being large didn't automatically mean I owed anyone unrestricted access to it, then deleted the whole thing before sending it, understanding, somewhere in the writing, that nobody in that thread was actually looking for an explanation. They'd already decided the shape of the story, and no amount of careful, reasonable typing from me was going to undo that overnight. I did eventually post something in that same group chat, weeks later, once the fraud investigation had confirmed everything, a short, plain summary of what had actually happened, the forged signature, the impersonated verification call, Paige's own rejected attempt from 6 months earlier. Was almost entirely silence, a handful of surprised reaction emojis, one cousin writing simply, "Oh, I'm sorry, Sloane. I didn't realize." Nobody offered a full apology for the earlier pile-on, and I didn't push for one. I understood by then that getting the facts on record mattered more to me than extracting a formal accounting from an aunt who'd probably already half forgotten sending that first dismissive message in the first place. The next morning, still shaken, and needing something concrete to hold on to, I pulled out an old accordion folder I kept in my closet. the one containing every piece of paperwork related to that account. Since I was a teenager, including a copy of the original custodial agreement my grandfather's attorney had drawn up the year I was born. I found the specific clause I remembered vaguely from childhood: full transfer of ownership and control to me, automatically the moment I turned 21, with the custodian's authority formally terminating at that exact date, no further action required on my part to make that transfer legally effective. I sat on my closet floor with that folder open in my lap for longer than I meant to, going through the rest of it slowly. Old statements from when I was a teenager, a handwritten card from my grandfather tucked in with one of the earliest ones, a card I hadn't reread in years. This is the start of something, Sloane. What you build on top of it is entirely up to you. I remember reading that card again after everything that had happened in the last 24 hours, a fresh, sharpened kind of anger, not just at my mother's phone call, but at the idea that something he'd specifically intended as mine to build had almost been quietly redirected without a single person asking whether that matched what he'd actually wanted. I turned 21 8 years earlier. According to the document sitting in my lap, my mother's custodial authority over that account should have ended, legally and completely, nearly a decade ago. I felt something settle into place reading that clause a second time, a strange mix of vindication and fresh alarm, vindication that I hadn't imagined the wrongness of what she'd done, and alarm at realizing that if her authority had already legally ended years ago, whatever she'd just done at the bank shouldn't have been possible at all, which meant something else, something I didn't yet understand, must have happened to make it work anyway. I called the brokerage again that same afternoon, this time asking specifically and formally, as the account's sole legal owner, for a complete summary of any recent changes and the documentation used to authorize them. It took 2 more calls and a formal written request before anyone actually sent me anything, but by Thursday morning an email arrived with a scanned account modification form attached. A joint owner addition request, dated 2 days earlier, listing my sister as new co-owner, accompanied by what appeared to be my own electronic signature authorizing the change. I opened that attachment standing in my kitchen, coffee going cold beside my laptop, and felt my whole morning narrow down to that single scanned page. The form itself looked entirely routine, the kind of document I'd probably glanced past a dozen times in other contexts without a second thought, until I got to the signature line, and found my own name rendered in handwriting that was close, disturbingly close, but not actually mine. I stared at that signature for a long time. I hadn't signed anything. I hadn't even known this request existed until my mother's phone call had already announced it as a finished celebratory fact. Whoever had submitted that form had used a signature that resembled mine closely enough, apparently to satisfy the brokerage's electronic verification process attached to a request I had never once seen, let alone approved. I'd spent my whole career explaining to clients why boundaries around inherited or custodial money mattered, walking anxious people through exactly this kind of scenario from the safe professional distance of someone else's account rather than my own. Sitting at my kitchen table with my own forged signature glowing on my laptop screen, I understood for the first time exactly how disorienting it feels when the careful advice you've given 100 other people suddenly applies directly to your own life instead. I closed the laptop for a minute, made myself another cup of coffee I didn't actually want, and made myself sit with the full weight of it before picking up the phone to call anyone else. I called Paige directly that Thursday evening, my hands actually shaking now in a way they hadn't been the day before, needing to understand, plainly, whether she'd known about any of this before Mom's celebratory phone call. She was quiet for a long moment before answering, her voice smaller than I expected. Mom said it was already handled on her end. She said you'd basically already agreed, that it was just a formality to make it official. I didn't think to question it, Sloane. I really didn't think I was doing anything wrong. I believed in that moment that she genuinely hadn't fully understood what handled had actually meant. I didn't yet understand how much more complicated that particular claim was going to turn out to be. Friday morning, 48 hours almost exactly from my mother's original phone call, I logged into the account to check its status and found a withdrawal already processed. $40,000, transferred out 2 days earlier, the same day the joint owner addition had gone through, to an external account I didn't recognize. I sat staring at that number on my screen for what felt like a very long time, understanding, with a cold, sinking clarity, that whatever had happened wasn't simply my mother overstepping out of misguided generosity. Real money, a significant piece of a down payment I'd spent years building, was already gone, moved somewhere outside my control before I'd even finished confirming the paperwork was fraudulent. I called Priyanka's office before I'd even finished processing the number fully, my voice steadier on the phone than I actually felt sitting there. Some practical, disciplined part of me, the same part that had built a career out of careful financial planning, seemed to take over the moment panic threatened to, walking me methodically through exactly what I needed to do next, even while another part of me was still staring at that withdrawal amount in disbelief. I called an attorney that same morning, a careful, no-nonsense woman named Priyanka Desai, who specialized in financial fraud and elder and family account disputes. She reviewed the custodial agreement, the modification form, and the withdrawal record over a rushed video call, and was quiet for a moment before saying the sentence that changed how urgently I understood my own situation. Your mother's custodial authority terminated legally 8 years ago. Whatever documentation the brokerage relied on to process this change and the withdrawal was either fraudulently prepared or fraudulently submitted, and either way, you need to move fast, both to freeze what's left in that account and to formally dispute the transaction that already went out. Priyanka asked me, near the end of that first call, whether I wanted to talk through the emotional side of what was happening before we moved forward with anything formal, aware, I think, that the professional side of my brain was working overtime specifically to avoid sitting with the personal side. I told her, honestly, that thinking too hard about the emotional side felt like a luxury I didn't have time for with $40,000 already gone, and the rest of the account still exposed. She nodded, understanding, and said we could always circle back to that part once the immediate danger was handled. I appreciated, more than I expected to, having someone in my corner who understood that triage sometimes has to come before healing, not the other way around. Priyanka helped me file an emergency fraud report with the brokerage's security division that same day, along with a formal request to freeze the account entirely pending investigation. The representative I finally reached, once escalated to the fraud team directly, confirmed something that made my stomach drop further. The modification request had included a customer verification call, supposedly with me, 3 days earlier, authorizing the change over the phone. I had made no such call. Someone apparently had impersonated me directly to the bank's verification department, on top of forging the paperwork itself. Digging into the brokerage's records with Priyanka's help over the following days, we found something that reframed the entire situation one more time. A nearly identical account modification request had been submitted 6 months earlier, requesting the exact same joint owner addition, and had been flagged and rejected by the brokerage's automated fraud detection system at that time, before it ever reached me or became a completed transaction. Someone had tried this once already, failed quietly, and then tried again, more carefully months later, refining whatever approach had gotten flagged the first time. Priyanka requested the submission details on that earlier, rejected attempt, and the IP address and device information attached to it traced not to my mother's home internet, but to an account registered under Paige's own email address. I sat with that discovery a long time, feeling the shape of the last week rearrange itself entirely. My sister hadn't simply gone along with something my mother had already handled. 6 months earlier, before my mother's celebratory phone call had ever happened, Paige herself had apparently already tried, and failed, to gain access to that account on her own. I remember reading the timestamp on that rejected attempt 3 or 4 times, doing the math against my own memory of that period, trying to recall anything unusual about my interactions with Paige 6 months earlier that might have hinted at what she was quietly attempting behind the scenes. I couldn't think of a single thing. We had a completely ordinary birthday dinner together that same month. She'd seemed, if anything, a little more upbeat than usual, and I remember feeling grateful at the time that whatever rough patch she'd been going through earlier that year seemed to be easing. Understanding now what had actually been happening underneath that ordinary dinner made the whole evening feel, in retrospect, like a scene I'd been watching from entirely the wrong angle. I called Paige again, This time, with Priyanka's findings printed and sitting on the table in front of me, needing the real conversation I hadn't gotten the first time. She broke down almost immediately, admitting, through tears, that the financial trouble she'd described to our mother as simply a hard time was actually a gambling debt she'd been hiding for over a year, one that had grown large enough that she'd started to panic about how to cover it without anyone finding out the real reason. I tried once myself, months ago, using an old form I found online, and it got rejected, she admitted. I didn't know what else to do, so I told Mom a version of the truth, just enough to get her to help me try again, and I let her believe it was more her idea than it actually was. I asked her as gently as I could manage given everything, how it had gotten so bad without anyone in the family noticing. She laughed, a short, humorless sound, and said it had started small, almost 2 years earlier, a way to blow off steam after a rough breakup, online poker nights that felt harmless at first, and then, slowly, stopped feeling optional. I kept telling myself one good week would fix it, she said, and then it just kept not being that week. I told her I understood the shape of that particular trap better than she probably realized, even if I'd never fallen into that exact version of it myself, and that the most important thing now wasn't the money, it was making sure this didn't quietly keep happening in some other form once the immediate crisis passed. Priyanka laid out my options once the full picture was clear. I could pursue this quietly through the brokerage's internal team. Fraud process alone, focused only on recovering the money without formally naming Paige as responsible for the forgery. I could involve law enforcement directly, given the clear evidence of identity fraud and forged authorization, understanding that doing so could carry real legal consequences for my sister. Or I could pursue a middle path, full financial restitution through the brokerage's fraud process, combined with a direct documented acknowledgement from Paige herself without pressing for criminal charges, provided she agreed to genuinely address the underlying problem rather than simply paying back what she owed and moving on unchanged. I thought about my grandfather, who'd set that account up specifically believing it would help me build something stable for my own future. I thought about the group chat, still sitting on my phone, full of relatives who'd assumed I was the selfish one before ever hearing a single actual fact. Understood, sitting in Priyanka's office weighing my options, that, whichever path I chose, I could no longer simply let this be smoothed over the way my mother clearly still wanted it to be, framed as a misunderstanding rather than what it actually was. I called Owen, a good friend from grad school, not related to any of this, someone whose judgment I trusted precisely because he had no stake in how my family's story turned out, and talked through the 3 options out loud with him for almost an hour, mostly just to hear myself reason through it in front of someone neutral. He didn't tell me what to choose, he just kept asking good, clarifying questions, the kind that helped me notice what I actually wanted underneath all the noise of the last week. By the end of that call, I understood that pure punishment wasn't actually the thing I was after, much as some tired, angry part of me might have wanted it in the moment. What I wanted was for the truth to be undeniable, permanently, and for Paige to actually get real help, instead of just a clean slate she might eventually gamble away all over again. I chose the middle path, and Priyanka formalized the fraud dispute with the brokerage while also drafting a direct, documented agreement for Paige to sign, full acknowledgement of the forged authorization and impersonated verification call, along with a structured restitution plan for whatever portion of the $40,000 the brokerage's investigation didn't ultimately recover directly. I called my mother separately, calmer than I'd managed all week, and told her plainly that her custodial authority had ended 8 years ago, that the account modification had been built on forged documents and an impersonated phone call, and that I needed her, for the first time in this entire situation, to actually hear the facts instead of the version of events that felt easiest to live with. My mother's response wasn't the immediate acknowledgement I'd hoped for. I really did think I still had some say in it, Sloane. I never imagined Paige would go that far on her own, or that I'd end up helping something that serious without realizing it. I believed that she hadn't known the full extent of the forgery when she made that celebratory phone call. I also told her, as gently and as firmly as I could manage, that not fully understanding what she was authorizing didn't erase the fact that she'd gone around me entirely, confident enough in her own outdated sense of authority that it had never once occurred to her to simply ask. She was quiet for a long moment after that, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost most of its earlier defensiveness. I think I've spent so many years being the one who smooths things over for both of you that I stopped noticing when smoothing something over meant steamrolling right past you instead. A full apology yet. It was at least the first time in this entire ordeal that she'd described her own role in it, honestly rather than simply as an unfortunate accident that had happened around her. We talked for almost another hour after that, longer than either of us had probably planned when the call started, working slowly through years of small patterns neither of us had ever named out loud before, how often she'd made decisions for the family, without actually checking with every member of it first, how often I'd let that pattern slide, because objecting always felt like more trouble than it was worth. I don't think I ever set out to treat your independence as less important than Paige's struggles, she said near the end. But hearing myself explain the last week out loud to you, I can't actually find a version of it that sounds like anything else. I told her I appreciated her getting there, even if it had taken $40,000 and a forged signature to make the trip. The brokerage's formal fraud investigation, once fully underway, moved with more thoroughness than I expected. They confirmed the electronic signature and verification call as fraudulent, reversed the joint owner addition entirely, and recovered roughly 2/3 of the withdrawn funds directly from the receiving account before it could be further drained. The remaining balance became part of Paige's restitution agreement with me directly, structured as a repayment plan she began that same month, alongside starting formal treatment for the gambling problem she'd been hiding for over a year. The fraud investigator assigned to my case, a plain-spoken man named Dale who'd clearly handled dozens of situations like mine, told me near the end of the process that cases involving family members were, in his experience, some of the hardest to fully untangle, not because the fraud itself was more complicated, because the people harmed by it were so often reluctant to push the investigation as hard as they would have against a stranger. "You didn't do that," he said. "You gave us everything we needed, fast, and that's exactly why we were able to recover as much as we did before it disappeared, somewhere we couldn't reach it at all." I hadn't expected that particular compliment to land as hard as it did, coming from someone who saw cases like mine constantly and had no real reason to soften anything for me. I didn't pursue criminal fraud charges against my sister, though Priyanka confirmed I had clear standing to. What I wanted most, once the money and the facts were both finally settled, wasn't to watch Paige face prosecution. It was simply for the truth of what actually happened to exist plainly, documented, in a place my family could no longer casually rewrite into a story about my selfishness instead of her forgery. Rebuilding anything with my mother and Paige after that took real time, most of that summer spent in careful, occasional conversations that didn't rush toward easy forgiveness. I told my mother plainly, more than once, that family helping family was never supposed to mean one person's boundaries simply didn't count, and that real help would have looked like a phone call asking, not a celebratory announcement of something already decided. She didn't have a clean response to that the first several times I said it. I think eventually some of it actually landed. Paige and I started having a standing weekly call that summer, something neither of us had ever done before, mostly just to check in, low stakes, nothing formal about it. The first few calls were stiff and careful, both of us clearly still finding our footing with each other. By midsummer, though, something had genuinely shifted. She started telling me, unprompted, about her treatment program's small victories, streak of weeks without gambling, a sponsor she'd connected well with, and I found myself looking forward to those calls in a way I hadn't expected to, given everything that had happened just months earlier. I don't think either of us could have predicted, back in April, that the 48 hours that nearly broke something permanently between us would end up being the exact thing that finally forced us into an honest relationship instead of a comfortable, unexamined one. I think often about my grandfather's original intention for that account, written into a custodial agreement decades before any of this happened, meant to give me something stable to build a future on. I understand now that stability isn't only about the money itself, it's about whether the people around you respect the boundaries that protect it, and I spent 48 hours that spring learning in the most concrete way possible exactly which members of my family were willing to do that, and which weren't. It's been 4 months now. The account is fully restored, solely and clearly mine, with proper documentation on file, this time confirming my mother's custodial status, ended years ago. Paige is 6 months into both her repayment plan and a structured treatment program, and we talk more honestly now than we ever did before any of this happened, her admitting, more than once, how much relief she's actually felt in finally not having to hide the real scope of what she'd been carrying alone. My mother still occasionally slips into the old, easy assumption that generosity between family members shouldn't need permission, but she catches herself now, mostly, before it turns into anything like what happened that spring. I finally made the offer on a house 2 months ago, smaller than I'd originally planned, given everything the last year had cost me in legal fees and lost time, but genuinely mine, closing scheduled for next month. Paige helped me pick out paint colors for the kitchen over video call last week, the two of us laughing over swatches in a way that felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely uncomplicated. My mother asked carefully whether she could come help me move in once the closing went through. I told her yes and meant it, understanding that saying yes to small, ordinary requests like that one was exactly the kind of slow, deliberate rebuilding this particular relationship actually needed going forward. I keep a copy of my grandfather's original custodial agreement in a small frame on my desk now, not the whole document, just the page with his signature and the date the account was opened. It's a strange thing to display, I know, a piece of financial paperwork instead of a photograph, but it reminds me, every day I sit down to work, of exactly what he actually intended when he opened that account for me. Not a fund for anyone else to quietly decide how to use, but one small, deliberate piece of proof that someone once believed my future was worth protecting on paper, in writing, permanently, whether anyone else in the family ever chose to respect that or not. That's my story. One phone call, one forged signature, and an account that finally, legally, belongs to exactly who it was always meant to. If this reminded you that generosity isn't really generosity when it isn't yours to give, take that as your sign today. Share it with someone who's ever had a boundary casually decided for them. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.